So let's get more now on one of our top stories this evening. David Cameron has set out his opposition to suggestions by some Eurosceptic campaigners that the UK could have a similar relationship with the EU to Norway. Mr Cameron told the Commons that such an agreement would not cut immigration. The Prime Minister is in Iceland, where he'll discuss his plans to renegotiate Britain's EU membership. Let's talk about this now. We're joined now by UKIP MP for Clacton, Douglas Carswell. He's in our Westminster studio. I'm also joined here in the studio by Lucy Thomas, Deputy Director of Britain Stronger in Europe. Douglas, first to you. The Prime Minister, as you know, has argued that a Norway-type relationship with the European Union actually could cost us hundreds of millions of pounds in lost trade, and it won't cut immigration.
He's absolutely right. Of course we shouldn't be like Norway. Norway has a terrible deal with the EU, almost as bad as the relationship that we have with the EU. They have to sign up to a lot of regulations they have very little say in. We have to sign up to all those regulations with very little say in. And like us, they have very little control over their borders.
So Nigel Farage, your leader, was wrong then when he says Norway thrives outside the EU because it saves on membership fees and red tape.
They've got a better deal than we've got, but it's not a good deal. I think that we could negotiate an even better deal. Look, the Prime Minister's in Iceland. They've got a population the size of Croydon, and yet they've got pretty good market access to Europe and free trade agreements with the world. If little old Iceland can manage a better deal, we can certainly, the fifth largest economy in the world, have a fundamentally different and better relationship. Look, let's not fall for this straw man argument. I've been campaigning for Britain to leave the European Union for 20-something years, and I don't know anyone who's seriously suggesting that Norway should be the model. It's a straw man argument. It's part of Project Fear.
OK, Douglas, let me bring Lucy in then to respond to that. Straw man argument, Douglas says, you know, I mean, one of the big problems is we don't actually know what we're voting for if we vote to stay in the EU, and we won't know what those negotiations have led to until after the referendum.
What we do know are all the overwhelming benefits of 40 years of membership of the EU, being part of the world's largest market with 500 million consumers. And I think what's interesting about what Douglas is saying, fine, he doesn't agree with Norway, but actually what would outlook like? What is this bespoke, special, magical deal which he thinks Britain will get, which gets all of those benefits
Douglas
that
says
we currently have.
We can get a much better deal than Norway.
Well, if we want to be part of the single market, we have to pay for that access and we have to comply with rules. So if Douglas doesn't want to be in the single market, then we lose all of those benefits. I simply don't see where this magical deal is, which, by the way, nobody else has ever walked out and got their own special magical deal.
On which note, if I may, Switzerland, which does 5 times more trade per head with the EU from outside the single market, manages to do that without being in the EU. It proves that actually it's possible to have better market access and be outside the EU. Look, last year we bought about £50 billion more stuff from Europe than we sold to them. That gives lie to the idea that the European Union is going to put restrictive barriers on cross-channel trade from which it is the principal beneficiary. We can leave the European Union and have better market access.
So you're saying you'd like to be like Switzerland? Well, our financial services sector would no longer benefit from the single financial passport. Global banks who are based here have said they would consider relocating, and they're actually already looking at properties overseas.
I think you'll find the chairman of Lloyds Bank actually said he was pretty relaxed about leaving. Now, Switzerland, they have a thriving financial sector.
Have said they'd reconsider.
I mean, Switzerland does have a thriving financial sector, but I think we can go even better than Switzerland. If little old Switzerland with 8 million people can get a better deal with the EU, then we with 60 plus can get an even better deal. And you know what, Lucy? Outside the European Union, we can have free trade agreements with China and countries where the growth is. That's
actually, the Chinese Premier was here this week and said he values our membership of the EU. I'm not sure we have the clout of negotiating a free trade deal on our own with 65 million people compared to 500 million people in the EU. We would get a better deal as part of Europe than
Iceland, with 300,000 people, the size of Croydon, has a free trade agreement with China, and I think that gives lie to the idea that in order to trade, you need to be part of a big trade bloc. Trade happens when a seller and a buyer find it's their mutual advantage to buy and to sell. Now, you don't need to be part of a trade bloc. If that was the case, then how come Iceland, with the population of 300,000 people, now has a free trade agreement with China with a population of 1.4?
On what terms, though? What kind of a deal would we get negotiating on our own? The Swiss free trade deal with China, it took 10 years for the Chinese market to open up to Swiss goods, and the Swiss had to open up their market immediately to Chinese goods. So it's a one-sided deal. Are you saying we're going to break with convention. We're going to get something that others haven't managed to get.
By definition, it can't be a one-sided deal, because the people in Switzerland doing trade with people in China find it to their mutual advantage to do that transaction, which is why it happens. But, you know, Switzerland has a free trade agreement with China. By being in the European Union, David Cameron could shake the President of China's hands, but he can't do what the leader of Iceland can do, which is actually to offer free trade agreements.
And the free trade deals that we benefit from at the moment with 50 countries in the rest of the world, we get those as part of being in the EU. We would lose those overnight, and it would take years to renegotiate them.
Let me put this both to you, because I don't need to be here. You're both doing a fantastic job, but let me put this both to you. Sitting here, listening to this argument now, well before the referendum, we've got Nigel Farage, some say misleadingly, some say not, saying that Norway is thriving outside the EU. We're hearing examples from Switzerland as well, and Iceland. Does this not present a case for the referendum actually to be brought forward? So we can get a consolidated campaign from both camps, instead of this trickle of information, which is sometimes confusing and misleading. Lucy first.
Well, I mean, I think there's a process of reform underway, and that will take however long it takes. And actually, I think over the years, those on my side of the argument haven't really put the case in the way that they could have done.
It's a harder argument for you to put forward.
I think there have been lots of sort of scaremongering stories, and Brussels has done this, and these horrible decisions have been taken.
I say that because your argument is more complicated, isn't it, to put forward?
Yeah, and I think, you know, we do have to explain what the benefits are in very simple terms, what it means to people in their back pocket, what our investment of £350 per family per year
to explain that.
Yeah, and what that means. But I think you're absolutely right. There is a danger that if it goes on too long, then people will get bored of it.
Douglas, would you like the referendum brought forward, or would you prefer a bit more time for a consolidated, considered argument?
Let's go long on this, and the reason is because we see today that David Cameron has given up on trying to win the referendum on the basis of a New Deal. He's resorting to Project Fear. There is no New Deal. He's trying to justify remaining part of the EU on the basis of the current terms, and the more obvious that becomes, the more obvious it becomes that he's got an empty proposition to put to us, the easier it will be to win over the undecideds. And the more we see of the other side arguing its points, I think that the stronger our chances of defeating them become. OK, we've got to leave it there. Douglas Carswell for UKIP and also Lucy Thomas from Britain Stronger in Europe. Thank you very much for your time this evening.